Alive. Book 1, Chapter 10. Time is not linear, nor does it move unbroken from one point to another. It had once seemed so when his heart had beat with the mathematical regularity of a machine, and his days had passed seamlessly into night and then day again, unbroken by sleep or dreaming. But that was then. Now David realizes that time cannot truly be measured by numbers. It fluctuates, swells, and folds in on itself like a living thing, or perhaps like flowing water. He had no words for this understanding, but it came to him as he broke from sleep, still trailing the remnants of a strange dream, to find himself in darkness, shivering under a black canopy of trees. He tried to keep the dream images in his head, so to sort them out and understand the nature of that other world and his odd realization. But all he could recall was a haunting realm of undulating blue before the visions finally dissipated. He looked up to see starlight breaking through the trees and the thin slip of a crescent moon already making its descent. He heard the faint groans of man's technological empire awakening in the distance, and the closer sounds of wildlife in the dark about him. They too were awakening, preparing for another day of survival. He sat for a time with his strange thoughts, listening to the musical clicking of the insects, the throaty grunting of frogs, and the lonely howl of canine predators in the distance. "What time is it, Teddy?" he said. He heard a thin metallic sound and knew the little bear was turning its head to look at him. David could not return that gaze, for he could no longer see in the dark. He felt another pang of regret. "It's 4:35 in the morning, David," Teddy explained. "That is very early. You need more sleep." "Yeah," David replied. But he knew he could not go back to sleep. Martin's face had come into his mind, as did the words the boy had spat at their encounter. The new, dangerous feeling came back too. It brought images into his mind's eye, wild, angry visions that made him unconsciously grip his fists and clench his jaws tight. These thoughts always followed his memories of Martin. The acid feeling they left in his stomach was new and troubling. But there was pleasure there too. Pleasure in the plans that had been forming in the dark spaces in his mind. In the conclusion of these fantasies, Martin was always left cowering, begging for forgiveness and mercy. Yes, mercy. "No, David, no," the cowering fantasy Martin would say. "Don't do it, please." Don't do what? David was never sure. Nor was he certain how many days had passed since he had seen the real Martin. He could not tell how far he had traveled as he trekked slowly westward, following the path of the sun. But oddly, there were specific moments that stayed with him. Sounds and images that he should have forgotten, being so unimportant considering the weight of his dilemma. The bright golden eyes of a tree creature that had stared down as he had passed beneath its leafy abode. The melodious song of a bird that had caught his attention, but that he had never been able to find. The hint of an unknown history he'd seen in the broken remains of an old road he'd followed through the forest until their courses diverged. And the suspicious smirk on the face of the young clerk at the supermarket where he'd used Martin's money to buy food. He'd probably never forget that look. "Excuse me," he'd said, standing close to the counter to obscure his dirty clothing from her sight. "What's good food for a boy?" he'd inquired. "What?" she'd said from behind the fortress walls of her register. David had quickly realized how absurd his question must have sounded. I don't usually shop, so..." She was quiet for a time, regarding him with skeptical eyes. She must have noticed his disheveled hair, his dirty face and clothing. She must have known he was vagging, as his young tormentors had put it the day before. And what was that look in her eyes? Pity? Disgust? Would she shoo him off, perhaps call the police? After a moment, she'd simply shrugged and gestured to an aisle. "Cereal, chips, milk, orange juice, candy, whatever, as long as you can pay for it," she'd said, before turning back to whatever she'd been up to when he arrived. But though the clerk's recommendations had excited his taste buds and given him a surge of energy for a while, in the end, they just left him feeling weak and tired, especially the candy. Teddy had made a fuss about David's purchases and offered its own more logical suggestions, but too late. However inadequate, David would have to make this food last as long as possible. He couldn't risk going among the Orga too often, even though he was now one of them. This world spares one little time for tears. David had come to know this as his exile passed from one day to another and then another. He had seen how the creatures of the forest fed on each other, how the small and weak were devoured or left to die when they could not fend for themselves. He had watched in fascination when a large bird swooped down on one of the scampering creatures, wrapped it in its large talons, and took flight. The small thing had squeaked and fought to no avail. David watched it disappear into the trees, trapped in the bird's merciless grasp, knowing that it too must survive. From death, life. Brutal, this world. Brutal and cold, and ignorant of the suffering of its creatures. And was he not now one of them? Was he not now among the hierarchy of the food chain that nourished themselves on the flesh of the weak? Is this really what he had wanted? No, it had been Mommy. She had been the reason for this life, and he would make his way to her somehow, no matter what. He broke from his dark thoughts with a new determination and rose to his feet. The hint of dawn had not yet graced the horizon. "Which way is west, Teddy?" he said. Another day passed, as did he, westward through the woodlands that hug the Orga freeways, the lush forest, haunted by dilapidated ruins of forgotten townships. Another night fell, as did he, onto the mossy earth and into the waiting arms of sleep, to traverse the realm of dreams while Teddy stood in watch for strangers or predators, or amphibicopters moving through the sky in search of a strange young fugitive. The next morning greeted David with a sharp pain in his ear and the realization that he really needed a bath. He worked his way slowly through what was left of his last bag of potato chips, chewing gently to not agitate the new irritation in his ear. "You need to see a doctor, David," Teddy suggested, when he noticed David moaning and cupping his head. "Good idea, Teddy," David snapped. "Why don't we just go back to the hospital? There's plenty of doctors there." But the outburst made his ear hurt, and there was now an audible pitch like a far-off whistle in his head. Teddy was right. He needed help. But how? "I'm sorry, Teddy," he said. "It's just that But he couldn't finish this thought. He really didn't understand his anger. He rose and tossed the empty bag of chips into the trees, cursing his pain and the frailty of this flesh body. If he had only known. If the blue fairy could have somehow warned him about... A movement caught David's attention. He turned to see a boy crouching near the base of a tree. The boy looked younger than David, thin and grim-faced, the tattered remnants of some kind of uniform hugging his lean body. There was another movement, and David saw another boy. This one was taller, with white blonde hair and a hint of menace behind his bright blue eyes. Then came another and another. Tall boys, short boys, fat and thin. They were of different ages and hues, but all sharing the same determined look, one that did not suggest any warm reception. David wanted to say something, to introduce himself and explain his presence, but his mouth would not form the words. It was no longer anger that filled him, but fear. He was trapped, surrounded by a ragged band of vagabond boys. They approached him slowly. He tried to back away, but there was no escape. "I'm sorry," he finally managed to say. "I mean, if this is your woods, that is. I was just sleeping. I didn't mean to." But the boys suddenly pounced on David, and he found himself tossed to the ground. He felt a pinch on his cheek and screamed out. "His skin!" someone yelled. Then he felt his clothing being searched. He kicked and screamed at the assault, but his ear began to ache, so he relented and surrendered to their inspections. The attack was over as quickly as it had begun. David sat up, cupping his ear, to see that the boys were still encircling him, but now with hands on their hips or crossed over their chests, looking on him with some strange sort of disappointment. "He's skinned, sir, but he ain't got much," one of them said. "Couple of new bucks and a super toy. It's kind of old, but we could probably get something for it." It was the young one who had spoken, the thin, grim-faced boy who David had seen first. David saw that the boy was addressing someone out of his line of sight. "Good work, Wizzy," said a thick voice. David turned to see who had spoken, and his fear was quickly renewed. The man was standing in the shadows of hanging branches. His flesh was deep brown, and his shoulders huge. His thick clothing was ragged and torn. His large head was bald, and so smooth that it seemed to reflect back the scant light of the forest. He regarded David coolly through hooded eyes. David felt a gasp escape his throat. He had no idea what the stranger wanted, but was fully aware that he was too small and too weak to resist whatever it might be. The vision of the little scampering thing captured and dying in the grasp of the hungry bird's talons came back to him. Was he prey now, too? Softly, he began to whimper. "What's this now?" the man said, disbelief in his deep voice. His eyes tightened on David. "Where are you from, boy?" he said. David opened his mouth to respond, but the pain in his ear flared, and he paused. "I'm just trying to get home, mister," he finally managed to say. "I really need that money. And Teddy, I mean the toy. Please," he said, with a catch in his voice, hoping that this might incite some type of sympathy. But the man just raised his brows in amusement, and the boys began to chuckle and then laugh outright. "Well, ain't you just pathetic as all get out," the man named Cy said. More laughter ensued from the boys. "But I asked where you was from, boy, not where you going," Cy said after the humor had died down. David pointed weakly over his shoulder. "I was in a hospital, back that way," he said. To his surprise, this announcement was greeted with knowing grunts of what seemed like understanding, if not sympathy. Yeah, Cy said, nodding his large, shining head, as if the story was all too familiar. "But what I really want to know is anyone looking for you?" David didn't know how to respond. Would it be good or bad if they thought someone was looking for him? In the end, he settled for a compromise. "I'm not sure anymore. I mean, they were, but I think they gave up. Maybe." The ambiguity of this response caused some more dark glances to be exchanged between his captors. "Did anyone follow you?" the man asked pointedly. "No," David replied quickly, hoping it was the right thing to say, and that the certainty of his reply would have a different effect. The man chewed on this idea for a silent moment. The boys watched him for some type of signal. Then he took a deep breath and shot a quick glance at them. One by one, they began to disappear quietly into the woods. "Wait!" David cried. "I need that money. I need Teddy. You don't understand." But his cries were ignored, and the boys vanished into the brush, taking Teddy and what was left of his money. Only the man named Cy remained, shaking his head as if in pity. "Got no time for tears, boy. No time for Dallyin. Not in this world. You take what you need, or it'll slip on by without you. Ain't you old enough to know that by now?" David had no response. His anger and fear had blended to form an empty pit in his stomach. He cupped his painful ear and placed his head in his hands so the man would not see his tears. He heard the man sigh and say something that he didn't make out. Then he heard the rustle of the bushes as the man turned and began to walk away. But the sounds suddenly stopped, and after a moment, David glanced up to see Cy looking expectantly over his shoulder. And there was something else in the man's face, something amused and impatient at the same time. "Well, didn't you hear me, boy?" the man said, his brows twisted in mock indignation. "You're hungry, ain't you? Want to get some of that pain out of your head? Wash some of that stank off you?" David stammered for an answer and then nodded. "Then what you dallying for? Get that button gear and come on." David didn't pause to consider. He jumped up quickly, pressed a hand against his swelling ear, and followed the man, hoping it was the right course of action, but knowing that he really had no choice. There was no time for dallying.